So welcome to this session about archival research in the heritage sector, co-hosted by the Institute of Historical Research's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community and the University of Oxford's Heritage Pathway Programme. Shortly, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Rachel Delman from the University of Oxford, who is going to chair today's session. But before I do, I just wanted to very quickly introduce the IHR's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community for those of you who have not come across us before. So the Centre fosters engaged, innovative research into places across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban, from the parish to the metropolis, with an emphasis on the localised, the micro-historical and the site-specific. It also works together with others to develop imaginative, new approaches to making history and to identify opportunities for history to make a difference in the real world today. You may have heard of the Centre's two flagship projects, the Victoria County History, which is a national network of place-based historians who are researching and writing the history of every place in England, and Layers of London, a digital resource providing access to historical maps of London and opportunities for members of the public to share knowledge about specific places in London. The Centre is positioned within the Institute of Historical Research, which is a physical place in London and a global community dedicated to participating in, supporting and engaging everyone in the process of making history. The Institute is part of the School of Advanced Study, which champions the arts and humanities in the UK and equips researchers to navigate and contribute to the UK's research and innovation landscape. So if you'd like to know any more about any of these things, everyone is very welcome at the IHR in person or to any of our online events and using all of our digital resources. I will add the relevant links in the chat later today. But now I'm going to pass over to Rachel.
Brilliant, thanks Ruth, and hi everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session. So as Ruth has mentioned, this seminar is a collaboration between the Oxford Heritage Pathway programme and the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. So I'm aware that some of you on the call will know me already, but for those of you who don't, I'm the Heritage Partnerships Coordinator in the Humanities Division at the University of Oxford, and I co-convene Heritage Pathway with my colleague Alice Purkis, who I think is somewhere on the call amongst the 110 participants we have today. So a very lively and healthy number of people on the call. So just a little bit of background then about Heritage Pathway. So it was really set up by the Heritage Partnerships team to introduce Oxford students and early career researchers to careers and current issues in the sector. And I should also flag at this stage that our sessions are open, our general sessions, other than this one, obviously, which is a kind of special edition. Our usual sessions are open to anyone who's on the Open Oxford Cambridge DTP as well. So if any of you are on the call, including India, one of our speakers today, you're welcome at all of our sessions, and you can sign up via InkPath, which is your usual training programme route. And we generally have 4 sessions per term, so including on-site visits to heritage sites and properties, and we're very collaborative in our approach. So we team up with colleagues across the sector and those from other divisions and within the university more broadly, and with other universities too, as we've done today. I wonder, Ruth, would you be happy to share the slide that I sent over to save me trying to navigate multiple screens? Brilliant, thank you. So just to give you a bit of context then, Heritage Pathway really sits within the wider ecosystem of the work that we do here in Oxford. We've got our faces and nothing else at the moment. Oh, that's exciting. So Alice Purkis and I are brokers and sector specialists. So we really sit between the worlds of heritage and academia. And our work is framed around the 3 core pillars that you can see here. So building partnerships, growing expertise, and sharing knowledge. So we work with a wide range of partners. The University of Oxford has an official partnership with the National Trust, which of course includes lots of country houses. But heritage for us is much more than country houses. So we work with a range of brilliant institutions, as I mentioned, the NT, Historic Royal Palaces, and English Heritage, and of course Blenheim, which we'll hear a bit more about today from one of our speakers, Aimee. But we also work with a diverse range of sites and local sites as well, including, for example, the London Charterhouse, which is a living heritage site in an almshouse. We're interested in museums and intangible heritage. So our remit is very broad. And our role as brokers and sector specialists is to co-design research projects from the ground up. So we work with researchers within the university and go out to our sector colleagues and see where the research need is on both sides. And we design mutually beneficial and targeted, relevant and sustainable projects. Our second pillar is growing expertise. So this is where Heritage Pathway comes in. So we support things like fellowships and funding, brokering and broadening connections between academia and the heritage sector. We support and set up a range of student placements and CDAs, and you'll be hearing from India and Amilia today, who are currently undertaking a placement with Historic Royal Palaces, which I was involved in setting up. And we also, as I mentioned, set up collaborative doctoral awards with the heritage sector, some of which are being advertised now, and we'll probably signpost to those if we have time at the end. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, we have Heritage Pathway, and we really encourage sort of integrated working practices between academics at all levels and the wider sector. And you can see our smiley faces at the bottom there. So that's me, obviously, my colleague Alice, and then two of our colleagues, Kathryn Eccles in the Oxford Internet Institute, who last year collaborated with us on Heritage Pathway to inject a digital element into our programme. And our brilliant research training manager, Caroline, and we also have another member of our research training team, Laura, on the call as well, who help us ensure that everything runs smoothly. So yeah, last year or earlier this year, I should say, gosh, time seems to be going by. We were very honoured to win a Vice Chancellor's Award from the university for all the various things we do with students and ECR engagement. And then, yes, our final pillar is sharing knowledge. So we build networks. We really encourage genuine cross-sectoral knowledge exchange. We always make sure that our work is mutually beneficial for both parties. And we're very much about collaboration and sharing best practice. So at the bottom here, you can see a toolkit that was created from one of our projects, which was with the National Trust on childhood and heritage National Trust properties. So yeah, so that's a bit about the work that we do. But today's session specifically focuses on heritage and archives, and we're very excited to have 4 brilliant speakers from a range of career stages and organisations who will speak to us on the ways in which archives inform heritage curation and conservation, among other things. So it's really the practical application of archival research in modern day decision making around heritage and placemaking. And just a reminder for those of you who've signed up, the questions that frame this session are: how do archives inform heritage practice? Who are the custodians of archives used within the heritage sector? Which job families within the sector use archives for their work? And how can heritage professionals make archives relevant to contemporary audiences? So we might want to bear those in mind as we go throughout the session, but I'm sure we'll have lots of other questions too from the speakers, and maybe about their career journeys as well, which I know they're going to speak to a little bit too. So as Ruth mentioned in her housekeeping, I'm aware that quite a few more people have joined the session since then. So we're a big number today, so please keep your mics muted throughout the session, just to ensure that we can hear everybody and that there are no disruptions. You're very welcome throughout to add your comments and questions to the chat. I think, again, being mindful that there's quite a few of us, it would be really helpful if you could put a C for a comment or a Q for a question, just so we can pick those out when we're going through them and make sure we can have as wide a discussion as possible. And just to reiterate for those of you who've just come in, hopefully you can see at the top of your screen that the meeting is being recorded. If you don't wish to be recorded, please keep your camera off. But as I say, you're welcome to put questions in the chat and we will read those out at the end. Great. Okay. So I think after all of that, we'll get started properly. So I'm going to kick off with some bios of each of our speakers. We're going to hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll keep our questions to the end. But as I say, if things do come up throughout that you're interested in or would like to ask about, do feel free to put them in the chat, but those won't be picked up until the end of the session when everyone has finished. So our first speakers today are Amilia, Gillies and India Wright, who are currently completing a doctoral placement with Historic Royal Palaces. So Amilia Gillies is entering the third year of her doctorate with the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of Kent, and her research, which explores scandals and corruption during the mid-Jacobean period, is funded by the Consortium for the Humanities and Arts South East England AHRC Doctoral Partnership. And India Wright is a third-year doctoral candidate at the University of Cambridge, and her research, which examines the architecture of the Inns of Court and Chancery in the late 17th century, is funded by the Open Oxford-Cambridge AHRC Doctoral Training Partnership and the Isaac Newton Trust. So as I've mentioned, India and Amilia will be speaking today about the curatorial research placement they've been undertaking with Historic Royal Palaces, which was initially set up through the Open Oxford-Cambridge DTP via the Oxford Heritage Partnerships team. So I had the pleasure of being involved in this one, and which I co-supervise with Dr. Alden Gregory from Historic Royal Palaces. So India and Amilia, over to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the introduction. I'll just share my slides. Oops. Okay, so thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to get to speak at this session about the exciting project that I've been working on, building the Royal Palaces, a project overseen by Rachel and Alden Gregory at Historic Royal Palaces. I think that this project provides a great example of how archival research informs the heritage sector. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to change it. So for those interested, I applied for this placement through Chase, my doctoral training partnership, which regularly advertises placement opportunities for their students. This is a 3-month full-time role, which India and I started in September, and the placement has been providing the invaluable experience of carrying out archival research for one of the UK's premier heritage organisations. Just last week, we went to Hampton Court and had the fantastic opportunity to present some of our findings from the past few months to the curators and researchers at Historic Royal Palaces. We got to hear from curators and researchers who will most likely be using our own research to facilitate future projects. So what is the work that we have been doing? Our principal tasks have been to access, photograph and produce calendar summaries of the Needham volumes. These are 18 manuscripts located at the Bodleian, the British Library, the National Archives and the University of Nottingham Special Collections, which recount the building works done under James Needham, Henry VIII Surveyor of Works between 1532 to 1544. These are bound volumes which detail the works done by the carpenters, plasterers, bricklayers, tilers, painters, labourers and many other artificers at the places of royal residence, divided into sections which roughly cover the works done within 1 month in one palace or manor. They also list the individual names of the workers, for how many days they worked, how much they were paid for their labours, and other information like from where and from whom the goods and materials were purchased. The summaries that we are making from their information will be used as finding aids to facilitate future curatorial work and research. These works accounts might sound rather dry on the surface and of interest only to architectural historians. However, these also provide rich information on the people who worked and resided in them, in the buildings, the materials and geography of Tudor London, Westminster and the surrounding areas, and politics, power and culture in the Tudor period more broadly. Just to give a vivid example, Rawlinson D777 recounts the lavish splendour of the Christmas festivities of 1534-5 at Greenwich Palace, where the Lord of Misrule and his company entertained the King and Queen and their guests against a backdrop of real trees that had been brought inside from the forest, and all enjoyed a grand Twelfth Night banquet upon a raised scaffold in the hall, only for it to be taken down straight afterwards. The account records not only what the guests would have seen, but also how the work had been done and the names, professions, and payments of the 35 workers who had all made it possible. A rich picture of the realities of court life becomes clear too, through the down-to-earth details, like rat holes being filled in Anne Boleyn's chamber, and a charming detail, for example, the construction of a frame over Prince Edward's bedchamber at the Manor of Moor in Hertfordshire to keep away the heat of the sun from his grace seems rather insignificant, but putting this into context, when this was done, the prince was only 3 years old, and it's therefore likely that this was such an important construction, considering how precious the health of the only male heir was. So as I mentioned, the information that in these documents provide crucial insights into the various areas of interest, research, and curatorial work. I would like to talk briefly about some supplementary material that I've been collating alongside the main calendar summaries. These additional documents have been helping me to make links and notice patterns in the material, and will also be available to those who will be using the calendars in the future. As well as a terminology glossary, which currently lists over 140 architectural, construction terms which were unfamiliar to me. I have been making a list of references to people of note. Alongside their names, I have been recording the works that were done in relation to them, which was usually the works being done in their chambers or lodgings, and then the building where this work took place, and the date of the work. In a separate list, I have been noting references to important or interesting works and the location and date. And these two lists are proving to enable observations to be made from the material. Keeping note of all the locations mentioned allows one to map who was living at which residence and when. The royal court, which was more centralised and settled compared to the medieval peripatetic royal household, was more centralised and settled, but the court certainly moved around with the king, often beyond London and Westminster. The royal fool sexton had chambers at both Windsor Castle and Greenwich. Edward Bainton, the vice chamberlain, had lodgings at least Greenwich and the Manor of Moor. And Mr. Norris, Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stall, had chambers in probably all of the locations that I have come across: Greenwich, Windsor, Eltham, Richmond, Ewelme in Oxfordshire, and Woking in Surrey, at least. I think this archival evidence has interesting implications for heritage and curation in terms of thinking about how these palaces and manors were inhabited and how that changed at different points in the year. So I hope to have given a taster of some of the information that I have been finding and the ways that I have been recording and presenting it, and the avenues of heritage and curatorial work that could be done with this. And I would be grateful for any further suggestions or thoughts. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks, Amelia. We'll hand straight over to India for part 2.
Hi everyone, hi, thank you. Right, I'll just attempt to share my screen. So, alongside Amelia, I've been working to record the contents of the Needham volumes for historic royal palaces, and I think I'm in the right seminar to confess that examining these historic building accounts has genuinely been one of the most enjoyable experiences of my life. So I'm excited to be here to talk to you today about these wonderful manuscripts. As an architectural historian embarking on this project, I was looking forward to learning more about the construction of the magnificent buildings documented, which I did, but I also found that these volumes are so much richer than I imagined. They contain a plethora of insights into the private lives of Henry and his innermost circle, shedding light on not just the buildings they occupied, but how they were used day to day, and how historic events found a built expression. I'm going to talk about the types of information contained in the Needham volumes, with a steer to the ways this may assist with curatorial interpretation and the conservation of buildings being cared for today. Broadly, the information within the manuscripts can be grouped into two main themes: architecture and construction, and people and networks. So the volumes are dominated by descriptions of piecemeal alterations, some large, others small, and maintenance across a wide selection of royal residences, with work ranging from elaborate decorative timber fretwork ceilings for the king to the construction of common jakes for servants. On a fundamental level, details of building work across the royal built estate help us understand what these buildings looked like. Those featured include Richmond Palace, Greenwich Palace, the Tower of London, Windsor Castle, Bridewell, Woking, Hunsdon, the Manor of the Moor, among many others. With many of these properties long since vanished, and with little in the way of visual evidence such as drawings or plans remaining, the volumes contain valuable information to aid us in reimagining these buildings. Knowledge of materials employed in works adds to the picture and can play an important role in helping to conserve buildings still being cared for. For buildings long since lost, the volumes can help us to pinpoint where they were sited, with the proximity of a property to local landmarks such as rivers, woods, and highways alluded to within descriptions of works and lists of materials. Zooming in, the volumes list a wide spectrum of chambers, which repeat at each property to varying degrees depending on their size. Rooms detailed range from the public and more formal spaces, including the Great Hall, the Watching Chamber, and the Chamber of Presence, to more private spaces, including the Withdrawing Chamber, the Reighing Chamber, the Closet, the Bedchamber, and the Stool Chamber. The sequence of these chambers or their location relative to others within each property is alluded to, and this can help us divulge the layout of buildings and how they may have been used. Also detailed are a wide array of service chambers to cater for the royal family and their entourage. Many of the storage or production of food, including the great kitchen, the pantry, the bakehouse, the sifting house, the boiling house, the confectionery, and the wine cellar. Further rooms for household storage include the wardrobe of the beds, the chandlery for candles, and the ewery for the storage of linens. The provision of such spaces not only informs our understanding of day-to-day life at royal Tudor residences, but also reveals the many people who would have worked in them, providing insights that could be used in curatorial interpretation and by a variety of historians. Works described extend to developments in the gardens and wider landscape of many properties. There is one delightful record of an arbour being constructed in the garden at Woking for the king to dine and sup in. Working through the volumes, a striking theme emerges for the extensive provision of sports and entertainment facilities across multiple properties. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Hawk Mews at Greenwich, a facility which enabled Henry to sleep close to his hawks to achieve better training outcomes, and provision was made for the sport of hawking at Windsor and Hunsdon. Kennels for greyhounds were built at Greenwich and Ampthill. A cockfighting place and a tilt yard were installed at Greenwich, as well as tennis courts at Greenwich, Richmond and Windsor. Deer houses were constructed in parks at Windsor and the Manor of the Moor, and a fence for keeping the deer in was erected around a park in Southwark. Bowling alleys at Greenwich, Grafton, Woking and Ampthill were all made ready for use in the summer of 1537. The grass was mown around the moat at the Manor of the Moor for his King's Grace to fish in. Archery butts were set up at Greenwich for use by both Henry and Anne in 1534. In 1536, butts and timber boards were used by Henry at both Greenwich and Windsor to practice shooting his handguns, and later, in 1542, when Henry's health was declining, a clerestory window was inserted into a chamber at Greenwich so he could see his butts more clearly to shoot at them inside the palace. Now, perhaps the most marvellous creation described is the water maze at Greenwich within the King's Great Garden, which was controlled by multiple stopcocks. All of these details can enrich the knowledge of historians and assist in the interpretation and management of historic properties and their landscapes. Sorry, computer's thinking about it. I'll continue. Moving on to the people named within volumes, as well as the king and the queen. Sorry. Certain chambers or lodgings within the royal properties are designated for the use of Henry's children. The shifting selection of the Queen's relatives. Sorry, I get to the right page. There we go. Sorry, everyone. as well as a wide array of courtiers and servants. Names are noted within descriptions of work undertaken or in details of glazing and ironwork supplied for projects. Certain people are assigned lodgings, meaning a set of rooms, some just a chamber for their own use. Some individuals are accommodated across a selection of properties over a series of years. I have so far assembled a list of 34 notable individuals, recording which properties they're accommodated at and on which date. This type of information can be cross-referenced with historical events to build a picture of the personalities present at a given time, deepening our understanding of the social and political dynamics at play within the Tudor royal court. The volumes also provide fascinating insights into the private lives of Henry and his family, with details of works or items of furniture made which divulge information about their preferences and personalities. For example, there are several entries which describe work alluding to Anne Boleyn being sensitive to draughts and noise, with windows and doors being filleted in her chambers and about her lodgings. One vivid entry for work done at Greenwich in February 1533 describes how 3 coops were made by the king's commandment to house the peacock and peahen brought to the king out of the newfound land, because the Queen's Grace could not take her rest in the morning for the noise of the same. With the squawking of peacocks proving so bothersome, it is perhaps no wonder that they ended up on the menu at Tudor feasts. Personal items of joinery include a black velvet-lined portable close stool for the king, and a prayer stool with folding feet for him, commissioned just after his first wife Kathryn's death in 1536. Also detailed are joinery works for breakfast tables with folding feet for Anne and Elizabeth, and a table with folding feet for Anne's virginals, a sort of small harpsichord, made shortly before Anne's execution when 2-year-old Elizabeth was at court. These items suggest mother and daughter were spending as much time together as possible, breakfasting together and Anne letting her daughter play at her instruments. Now, at first glance, these details might seem trivial, but they provide us with incidental insights not available anywhere else in the archives, and combined with historical knowledge, they tell us of private responses to significant events, adding an added dimension to our understanding of these historic figures. As well as descriptions of the building work undertaken, the volumes contain the names of all those who worked on each element of a project, be they carpenters, bricklayers, masons, tilers, plasterers, plumbers, labourers, or even dung farmers. Also listed are the clerks overseeing the work, those supplying materials, and those carrying them to site. The volumes shed light on how networks of skilled tradesmen and labourers were administered and managed in order to meet the demands of an extensive and ongoing programme of works across multiple sites. An impressive example of the workforce which could be mustered at short notice is seen in preparations for Anne Boleyn's coronation, when 100 carpenters were brought in to work double time at Westminster Hall in the week running up to the ceremony, no small feat when you consider the challenges of communication and transportation 500 years ago. The volumes divulge a degree of diversity in the workforce of Royal Tudor building sites and among those supplying materials. Women of both low and high status appear as suppliers of items such as buckets and candles, and materials including lime, red ochre, and oak trees, as well as for carrying items to site. I have also unearthed the presence of Black Tudor artificers and labourers working at royal properties, including Greenwich, Westminster, Woking, Petworth, Richmond, and Ampthill, working on important historic events such as the coronation of Jane Seymour and efforts to quell the Lincolnshire Rising. Their presence causes us once again to readdress our ideas about race in Britain in the 16th century. Alongside my summary transcriptions of each manuscript, I've recorded my key findings on a fully referenced multi-tab spreadsheet to aid curatorial interpretation of the volumes. When my placement with historic royal palaces ends, I will focus once again on my PhD, which examines the architecture of the Inns of Court and Chancery in the late 17th century. In an era before the architect and the widespread use of plans and elevations to communicate design, building accounts are my main primary source for understanding the architectural developments of the inns at this time. Similarly, the Needham volumes provide vital evidence for understanding and interpreting the Royal Tudor built estate, fundamental for historic building curators and those working to conserve Tudor properties. The volumes are also a remarkably overlooked and rich resource for historians working more broadly on the Tudor period. As highlighted, far from being a dry record of expenditure, they offer insights into the private lives of the royals, their courtiers, and ordinary Tudors alike. And I hope that the work of this placement will bring these forgotten anecdotes back to life for as broad an audience as possible. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, India. Thank you to both of you. It's a really rich illustration of your brilliant findings in the archives and the built heritage we see today. And just to flag that India and Amelia have only been working on this placement for a couple of months. So yeah, it's really impressive what's been thrown up as a result of your research. There are already quite a few questions in the chat. As I said, I'm going to leave those until the end. Obviously, they are specific to this project, but in the interests of keeping to time, we'll move on to our next speaker now. But I have noted those and we will come back to them at the end. So thank you, and do keep your questions coming throughout. So we're going to move to Aimee-Anna now, who's the Built Heritage Administrator at Blenheim Palace. And Amy's background is in architecture and planning, but after wanting a career change, she started a project management apprenticeship at Blenheim, which I might add she passed recently with flying colours. She will be talking a bit more about her background, as well as delving into the role of archival research in conservation and current research projects at Blenheim Palace. So I'll pass over now to Amy.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Hi everyone, hope you're all well. I thought I'd start a little bit about my journey and how I ended up here. A little bit about myself, as Rachel said, I'm a project administrator in the Built Heritage team at Blenheim. We're a very small team of just 3 of us. Kelly in the middle is the head of Built Heritage. She's a registered architect and is responsible for the strategic oversight and delivery of all the restoration and conservation projects at Blenheim in the World Heritage Site. Chris is our clerk of work. He's the hands-on man, he's on the ground, and he knows the palace inside out after working here for over 30 years. And then there's myself, project administrator. My role is wide and varied and always exciting. And I promise I'm not just saying that because this is being recorded. Most obviously, it involves supporting the team in overall administration and document control of our project, but also facilitating communication across our internal stakeholders and teams, as well as attending site and checking on progress with Chris. I also champion the social sustainability of projects and, of course, utilising the archives in the creation of statutory documents required as part of the planning process for many of our projects, such as design and access statements or heritage significance statements. Together, we're responsible for £40 million of conservation within the World Heritage Site, and that's across 10 years. This figure was actually calculated in 2016, where it's thought that £40 million of restoration was required, ideally within 10 years. However, because of COVID, Brexit, other financial crises, as well as the ongoing deterioration of the palace, this is probably like closer to 65 million by 2036. So how did I get here? I'm an Oxford native. I've lived in Oxford my whole life. After completing my GCSEs and finishing my IB diploma, I went to Newcastle University to study architecture and urban planning. My plan at this point was to be an architect, but after completing my master's also in architecture, but during COVID, I found myself at a bit of a career crossroads. And I didn't want to be an architect anymore. I wanted to change my career, but I also wanted to start working as soon as possible. And it was a friend, knowing kind of my passion for heritage and also my educational background in architecture, that signposted me to my apprenticeship at Blenheim. So now, getting into the theme of today, I'll be presenting the case study of the Orangery at Blenheim. But first, a peek into our archives. Blenheim actually has its own archives. It's not open to the public, but it's a unique private collection of historically significant material relating to the Spencer Churchill family, Blenheim Palace, and the wider Dukes of Marlborough's estates. Our archives are run by a wonderful lady called Dr. Electa Frost. and she is also supported by some other part-time staff. One of my first tasks, as it were, when I joined Blenheim was to get to know the archives, and I found that it was a really useful way of starting at the beginning, in a way, looking at various books and documents, maps, drawings and photographs. And images that I've chosen are a few of my favourite maps that I've come across, which kind of show various plans of Blenheim and the estate as it's developed. So just a bit about Blenheim. Blenheim Palace was constructed from 1705, and it was funded at the beginning by Queen Anne. It's a Grade 1 listed building within a Grade 1 listed parkland, and the entire site is the only privately owned World Heritage Site in the UK. It is a landscape that is layered by pre-Roman history, and this is kind of the defining point of the World Heritage Site, and the palace is part of that. Our status definitely comes with some scrutiny, but then we also have excellent working relationships with both our local conservation officer and Historic England. You can see the orangery to the right, covered in scaffold, so sited in the Eastern Courtyard. It is one of the most diversely used spaces, and it was originally a working day greenhouse space for overwintering citrus fruit. It's also been a theatre, a gallery, an office, and today it's used as a restaurant. So whipping through the Orangery project as an example of how important the role of archives can play. Bearing in mind, this project kind of came into fruition over 5 years ago, so this is an abridged version. This was the orangery beforehand. This is without all the window dressing and the filter of the previous image. Despite how grand it looks here, on closer inspection, you would start to see the cracks. The orangery roof was way beyond the end of its life. It leaked, it overheated, and it required a significant amount of cooling in the summer and heating in the winter. It was replaced in the 70s with a 20-year lifespan, so replacement was well and truly overdue. In 2019, we did get permission to replace the glazing from a single glazing to a double glazing, similar to what we have on the other side of the orangery over the gift shop. However, the appointed contractor went bust and COVID hit, so the project was put on hold. When the project was picked back up again, the question arose of keeping or replacing the glass roof, albeit with double glazing, or perhaps doing something radical and going with a solid roof. You would think that because we conserve, that's what we do, it would be an obvious replacement, a like-for-like replacement. But do we have to do that? So what followed was a year of research, and that was sending out teams of researchers and architects into our own archives, into the Bodleian, the British Library, and pretty much across every orangery constructed of the same period. Archive research was undertaken to find out as much as possible about the phases of work to the orangery and to provide a stronger justification to re-roof in the solid material rather than the glass. A solid roof was desirable because it was more sustainably, environmentally and economically, and it's also much easier to maintain. We knew the roof was solid when it was built, as the cast iron structure was clearly 19th century. We didn't know whether the roof was slate or lead, which led the Conservation Officer and Historic England wanting to know in terms of granting permission to do this restoration project. The archival research revealed the history of the use of the orangery and also indicated that slate would have been likely in the construction of the original roof. This is not possible to prove conclusively due to the lack of evidence, but it was a theory that was backed up by the structure of the adjacent roofs and pictures from publications after the fire which destroyed the original roof. The artistic impression of the remains following the fire shows charred roof timbers above the eaves, which implies the orangery would have had a solid roof structure as its primary construction phase. Within the Blenheim archives, quotes were found dating 1906, which read, "I have examined the roof of the conservatory where damaged by the gale. I find there is a great deal of glass broken. It is very difficult to measure it all up." This confirms a programme of repairs was carried out in the early 20th century. The roof construction was most likely the same at the adjacent kitchens and the pantry, a timber king post truss with a slate roof. Whilst the entire palace would have originally been designed with lead roofs, over time most have been changed to slate with a few exceptions. Slate requires a steeper pitch than lead, and so evidence of the change is almost always found within the roof structure. This is not the case in the East Courtyard buildings, which led us to believe that they were always slate, probably as they were later additions to the palace by the first Duchess. Designed by Vanbrugh to be far more elaborate, they were constructed around the times that funds were running low, which also explains why there is very little to no evidence of the design/construction of these buildings. The archival research was necessary to form the argument to revert the orangery roof to solid construction rather than glass. If we had not been able to find any supporting information in the archives, we may have been refused permission to restore the solid roof, which would have been a significant impact on the ongoing sustainability and cost of maintaining the restaurant in the orangery, which is a major source of income for the conservation as a whole of the World Heritage Site. And now the orangery has returned to a restaurant, and it's a multifunctional space that is commercially viable, but maybe more importantly, also environmentally stable. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Amy. A really interesting comparison with the last project, thinking about you having archives actually on site and in situ at Blenheim, which is something I think we might come back to in the Q&A at the end. And also a really lovely illustration of how archives can inform what we might regard as the more kind of scientific elements of heritage practice. So we might naturally think of the relationship between archives and heritage interpretation, but yeah, it'd be really interesting to come back to those points around conservation as well. So thank you for that. Great. Okay. So last but not least, then I think Kath has a stable connection now. So I think we're good to go with our third speaker of the our fourth speaker, I should say, third project of the session. So Dr. Kathryn Maude is the head of medieval records at the National Archives, and she works on the histories of gender and sexuality, and is interested in encouraging wider engagement with medieval archival material, which I think she's going to speak to us about now. So I will hand over to Kath.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. I had some problems joining this morning, but I'm here now. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some projects that I've been working on at the National Archives. So as Rachel said, thank you for the introduction. I'm the head of medieval records. And for those of you who don't know, the National Archives is a central UK government archive. So we hold records created by law courts, central government departments, the military. We've got a lot of World War I, World War II records and earlier military records. And so for the medieval holdings, this means we've got records of the king and his court and the major departments of state. So the Exchequer, the Chancery and courts of common law. So in terms of our kind of materials here, can you see my screen still? Yeah, okay, great. In terms of our records at the National Archives, we hold a whole range of medieval records. And my job as a record specialist is to work through a whole range of different elements. So I work with the events team to put on events. I support exhibitions in my specialist area if any come up. I write content for the website. I work with education team. I support cataloguing. I pursue my own research into the records, which is what I'm going to talk mostly about today. And I work with external partners to put on exhibitions relating to our records, and lots of other things that come up as I go along. This is a picture I took of the outside of our building one day with a beautiful rainbow. So I always use it in presentations now. So here are three kind of pieces that I've written recently for the website. And as I said, I'm kind of, well, as Rachel said when introducing me, I'm really interested in thinking about perhaps hidden stories in the records. So that could be things like this cold and flu remedy that comes quite
Hi,
a kind of
Kath.
little
I'm sorry
story.
to
Oh, yeah,
we can't
no.
actually see the slide that you're currently
Oh,
on. There
great.
we go.
Okay. Oh. Is that, can you see my slides now?
That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
okay,
They're not in
Sorry.
full slide mode at the moment, which might be the reason why they weren't flicking through.
Okay. Okay, can you, if I'm sharing them now, can you see them now?
So we can see we can see the one with the website content, I presume, but you'll just need to make sure that you're moving on the, we still can't see the full screen.
Oh. 1 second, apologies for that. I'm using the web Zoom, so
yes.
it's because my other Zoom wasn't working. So let me see if I can share. Okay, 1 second, apologies for that.
This happens to all of us, doesn't it?
Let me, I am just going to share my entire screen, I think. Can you see that now on full
Yes,
screen?
we can. That's
okay,
perfect.
Great. Let me do that. Apologies for that. Sorry.
No, not at all. Good problem solving.
There we go. So I can't see any of you. So if you have a problem, put it up in the chat and hopefully it should come up. Apologies for that. So here's the lovely picture of the rainbow if you didn't manage to see it before. So here are the kind of three projects that I've been working on a little bit more recently. Medieval cold and flu remedy, a list of immigrant Londoners from 1483, and a project on an island called Ravens Are Odd. And that's the case study I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, although I can share these pieces of web content in the chat in a second. So Ravens Are Odd was a short-lived island in the mouth of the Humber. It comes out of the sea in about the 1230s, and it sinks again beneath the waves in about 1360. So I did quite a lot of research with my colleague, Professor Emily Robinson at the University of Sussex, into the history and afterlives of this island. So I was particularly working on its history, and Emily was working on the kind of folklore and afterlives related to this island. And my research into the archives has really emphasized or kind of informed the outreach and engagement work that I was able to do. So I'm going to talk to you for like 2 minutes about the research I did, and then we're going to move on to a couple of the outputs before we go into questions. So for those of you who've been to Spurn Point, Spurn Point is a kind of point at the end of the Humber, a headland that comes out. This is the view. So when we're imagining Ravens Are Odd, this is where we're imagining, at the end, the mouth of the Humber River in the northeast of England. So there had been quite a bit of academic research, particularly 19th century academic research into Ravens Are Odd before. And one of the things that work did was identify and translate a lot of original documents. However, as those of you who've worked at the National Archives will know, the 19th century referencing sometimes changes quite a lot to the present. And so the first stage of the research was to identify the original documents that the 19th century historians had identified and retranslate them myself. So this is an example of one of the documents. This is the first kind of lengthy description of Quedampava Insula, a certain small island that was called Ravensode. And my favourite thing about this one is that the document, which is otherwise quite a dry legal document, talks about the island being born, nata fuit, so it kind of comes out of the sea. So the first stage was to identify these 19th century references and take them back into the archive, so to find all of these original documents. And then I wanted to think about what documents were available to me now because of cataloguing or because of a kind of a change in the way scholarship works, since these kind of 19th century scholars had looked at this piece of work, because the original documents haven't really been returned to very much since the 19th century. So then I started to think about our islands' names across time. So I started to look at all of these different places in our records across this whole period that Ravensode is around, and to look through the changes in the island's name. And so you can see at the top here, this is actually my favorite one, because you can see there's a little face in the R and a little ear in the middle of the R. So we've got a little face there. And here are some other examples, and you can see the kind of timeline of the way the island's name changes over time. And I started to also look at the manorial accounts. So the manorial accounts for Ravensode, we talked quite a lot about accounts today. I wasn't expecting there to be so many other devotees of an otherwise boring account book. So the Ravensode manorial accounts, they're part of the Manor of Holderness, which at the time that Ravensode was around had one of the biggest landowners in the country, the Counts of de Fortibus, and this was actually Lady Isabella de Fortibus, who was this kind of very, very important landowner in the 13th and early 14th centuries. And so the manorial accounts talk about the incomings and outgoings of the manor in this time period. And so I looked through all of these accounts. We have about 60 years of unbroken accounts. I've been making some graphs. If anyone would like to see a graph, let me know. And I found this piece, this document. And you can see at the bottom there, I've circled it in black, Ravensode. So this is the name of our sunken island. And this document comes from 1355. You can see above Wylefleet, Potterfleet, and Staneth, and the accounts for those places. But by 1355, Ravensode just has a blank space next to it. And so this really is the end of the island. We've got here the beginning of the island, the birth, nata fuit, it was born, and then here this kind of the island's end. And this document had been catalogued, so I could find it, but nobody had really worked on these manorial accounts before, and so no one had previously noticed that we have this kind of testament to the island's demise. It was being washed away slowly by the sea. So what did I do with this material? So working with my collaborator, Emily Robinson, we took our project to Hull Maritime. And Hull Maritime are a community, an organisation in Hull funded from various places, working through the council to refurbish the Maritime Museum in Hull, which is ongoing, it's not yet reopened. And while that Maritime Museum was closed, which is a big kind of part of the centre of Hull, to kind of take that work outside of the museum and into the community. So we got in touch with them and said, would you be interested in doing something about Ravensode? And they were, which was fantastic. And so we worked with Hull Maritime, with Hull History Centre, who are the local archive in Hull, and also with a range of different stakeholders to create an ongoing project, it's still going on, to take some of our archival material like this out of London and out of the National Archives and into the local community. So one of the really exciting outputs of this for me, because it really draws directly on some of that research I did, was this incredible graphic novel that Gareth Slateholme drew and wrote for us. You can see on the right of the screen here that all of the different names of the island that I identified were used in the graphic novel, including the one at the top with the little face. So that was fantastic. And this is being given out free. It's also available online. I'll send the link in the chat. And we also put on an exhibition. And the two things that we took down were the 1299 charter roll, so that's the left-hand side, and that manorial document that I was just showing you. And we were able to show these alongside the charter for Hull in 1299. And the reason that I've circled two things on the left here of this document on the left of your screen is that the top one, if you squint, you might be able to see it, says for the Burgesses of Kingston upon Hull, and the one at the bottom says for the Burgesses of Ravenswood. And those two charters, this is a charter roll, those two charters demonstrate that Hull and Ravenswood get their charter on the same day, April the 1st, 1299. And Hull still has its original 1299 charter. So we were able to show the charter roll, which is the central office copy of those charters, next to Hull's original 1299 charter, which was really, really fantastic. And it was probably the first time that the charter roll has left the archives in London and gone up to be reunited with this 1299 charter. But because Ravenswood sank under the sea, that charter didn't exist anymore. And we called the exhibition, you can see the poster here on the left, Hull, Ravenswood, Twin Cities Sunken Past. So the idea was that these were born on the same day and that Hull continues, whereas Ravenswood has sunk under the sea. The exhibition you can see on the bottom right there. And we also worked with a fantastic consultancy, an art consultancy called Square Peg Hull, who did a series of workshops getting children to create lost objects and lost townspeople from Ravenswood that we also displayed in the exhibition. So it was a really, really great opportunity for me to take some of this research that I'd been doing about this sunken island, bring it out into the community in Hull. And actually this exhibition is now on tour, and so the exhibition's currently at Withensea Library. If you're anywhere near Withensea, it'll be there until the 3rd of December, and then in the new year we're going to be taking it across the river into Lincolnshire and showing it along the North Bank in kind of community centres and libraries. And so it was a really great opportunity for us to kind of take this work outside of London and into kind of communities around the Northeast and around the Humber, where this story began. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and apologies for my slight problem with my screen sharing. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear your questions and to hear from everyone else. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kath. That was brilliant. And something that's just really struck me across all of your presentations is that, you know, the words boring or dry might be used about archives, but you've all really beautifully illustrated how dynamic and rich these documents are and the kind of multiplicity of things you can do with them and get people to engage with them in different and creative ways. So yeah, that's brilliant. And also just to say that if you're interested in the project that Kath was talking about, Adam Chapman has very kindly put a link in the chat, although I'm realizing the chat's going a bit crazy now, so it will be moving up gradually, but it is in there. So if you're interested, do have a look at that link. Great. So we've got a healthy amount of time for lots of discussion now. You can see there are already lots of questions, as I've mentioned, but I just thought I'd use Chair's prerogative and kick off with a question that was related to something I mentioned earlier after Amy's presentation about as we've seen, we've got archives in all different places, like travelling archive seems to have been a theme today. And especially, Kath, you were talking about the fact that, you know, the benefits of having taken that Hull, that record to Hull and having those two archival documents side by side, and how, yeah, what an amazing kind of opportunity and experience that was. But I wondered if we might reflect a little bit on like some of the challenges of connecting archives up with buildings, or even archives with other archives as well. So yeah, it's a question to the group as a whole. I don't know who wants to come in first. It's always that thing, isn't it? The silence after you throw a kind of scattergun question open.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in, and then maybe I can pass to other people, because I think my experience is very slightly different, because the research is into a place which is no longer there, right? So I couldn't kind of go to the palace or to go to the place because the island is gone, and there is quite a lot of argument, which I take no position on, about where it actually was exactly. We know it was in the mouth of the Humber, but obviously that's quite a big area. And so one of the things that we really wanted to think about was what is still there and what isn't still there. And so working with Hull History Centre was a really nice way of doing that, to kind of, especially because there is, I think, a kind of perception that Ravensrod is not known about. It's always talked about as this kind of lost island, but also kind of lost to people's knowledge. People in Hull will often say things like, well, obviously everyone knows about Dunwich, which is this sunken medieval island on the south coast, but no one knows about Ravensrod, and that's because it's in the north, right? So there was some kind of it was especially important, I think, to take those documents kind of up. But the other thing that is a challenge, I think, is that a lot of smaller archives, we were really lucky to be working with Hull History Centre, because they have a conservator. That made it possible for us to send documents from the National Archives to the History Centre. But if they don't have an on-site conservator and nobody who's able to kind of monitor the materials and monitor the safety of the documents once they kind of leave the archives, it isn't possible for the National Archives or any archives or museums to lend things to some community spaces, because there isn't the kind of infrastructure available there. So I think that there's something that we could think about, I think, more generally across the archival and heritage sector, about how these loans might work in future and how we might be able to kind of take more documents out, but also working more with facsimiles and working more with kind of images of documents and making these and taking these things out. So for example, the exhibition in Withensea Library and these exhibitions that we're doing around the kind of area where the island would have been, right on the river, we couldn't take the original documents to those spaces because they're not secure enough and because they don't have the right conditions for to keep the documents safe. And so we had to find kind of other ways, and working with the community groups to kind of create new documents was one way that we kind of managed to do that. But it definitely was a challenge, because we want everybody to be able to see the originals, but sometimes that's not possible. And so what do we do instead? And that was definitely something that we, kind of worked with. I'm going to put somebody else.
Yeah, really interesting points about archives allowing space for imagination, particularly in relation to lost buildings and resource as well. I know India and Amilia, you've got an interesting challenge in that some of the buildings you're coming across have very little or no remains, and then others are very much in front of you as as heritage sites like Hampton Court and the Tower of London. And Aimee, you've got that challenge as well, I guess, of having the archives there for a building which is very much still present, and how that informs the decision making. So I don't know if any of you want to reflect a bit more on that.
I would say it is an interesting challenge, because you would think that having our own archives would mean that everything that was ever done has been documented, but we're actually finding that that's not the case, and there's huge gaps in institutional knowledge. And we know that it's happened because, like I kind of said in my presentation, the on-site evidence is there. However, when we do go into our archives, there's nothing to be found of it. And we also have the challenge of our archives kind of being split into two. So we have some that we host as our own in Blenheim, but actually a lot of it is in the British Library. And so that poses its own challenges as well, trying to match up the evidence. A lot of the archival material that we have is correspondence. So we find that often we're actually only getting one side of the story, and it's usually the side of the Dukes. Whereas there's obviously someone on the other end that has something to say that maybe we don't have as much access to, or it's not as easily accessible. So in that, there can cause some issues as well. And then we also have the same issues of space, despite it being a palace, our rooms, our usable rooms are quite limited. So that's one of the reasons why it remains kind of a private archives, and we definitely do have dreams and visions of opening it up to the public, but it's about, as Kathryn was saying, kind of doing that in a way that it's safe not only for the documents, but for the people, and it's in the correct environment. But yeah.
Thanks, Amy. So many interesting things in there, including whose perspective we're getting in the archives as well, and yeah, the kind of the breadth of what's represented. And of course, I guess you had Woodstock Palace before you had Blenheim as well. And I was just reminded of that I had a conversation with Kath in the summer that TNA have a document that you were working on, Kath, I think, for a blog post about Christmas at Woodstock. So yeah, another sort of connecting up between different heritage sites. I don't know, India and Amelia, did you have any thoughts on that?
I've been struck by how many properties are within the Needham volumes that just the sheer scale of properties owned by Henry VIII during this period. I had no idea that existed, and sadly many of them are long since lost. I think there's another project somewhere online which charts all of the properties and the manuscripts you can research them with. And there are a number of properties we still don't know the actual physical locations of, because they've totally been demolished, and I guess their materials taken away. So these volumes, as I pointed out, can help us kind of pinpoint more closely where they actually were, with reference to physical landmarks nearby. And then there's striking properties such as Greenwich Palace, which was a vast structure, and also Whitehall Palace, which, you know, in the centre of London, which is hardly any trace of it anymore. But these volumes help to recreate these long lost buildings. So it's been really fascinating to look at them.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that concept of sort of networks of buildings that you get through these documents. Amelia, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I was going to say how the documents that we've been working on usually are they're very much for the purpose of recording what was going on right at that time, but in some ways they also give an insight into what was there before. So obviously this was the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, where a lot of recycling was going on in terms of the stones from the monasteries were being used to make the new building. So there was one that was talking about Barking Abbey, that was they were taking stones from Barking Abbey to build Dartford, the manor of Dartford. So it tells us about how Barking was set up. Like it was quite sad to read it, because it was such a detailed description of smashing the stones up and then taking the best ones to build a new palace. But it says it also tells us about what the original building looked like too. So it's the present as well as the past.
Yeah, really interesting thinking about the kind of life cycles and biographies of buildings, and as you say, the kind of that emotive element of buildings being destroyed as well, and how that can feel quite kind of violent. And often we think about buildings, don't we, in terms of kind of fixed, I know we've talked about this together, sort of fixed periods of time. So we talk about like a late medieval building or an early Tudor building, but these documents really give a sense of the changes that were happening all the time, I guess, which is the case today in heritage conservation as well. You're having to think on your feet and make changes all the time. Right, I'll go to some of the questions in the chat now, but do keep them coming. I'm aware we've got quite a lot of people, as I've mentioned, on the call. So if you'd like to raise your hand, you can, but it might be easier if you put questions in the chat. But if you're unable to do that, do please use the raise hand function, and I'll try and get to you if I can. So yeah, the first question we had, which I guess loops back to what we've been talking about, is from Christopher Curry about why are the Needham manuscripts so scattered? Shouldn't all of them have been in public records? Who nicked them? And were they used in the history of the King's works? So they ended up in private collections and then were acquired, as you've rightly identified, rather haphazardly by different libraries and archives. The Bodleian by far has the most of them, and recently acquired, I think it was 2017, acquired another one that came up for sale on the private market. But yeah, it's quite an interesting question in terms of, we've obviously talked a little bit about time and resource in relation to archives, but one of the reasons that this project is happening is because on the ground, the curatorial team and the research teams at HRP do refer to these documents, but they've never been studied at length, partly because they're just all over the place, you know, in Nottingham, the BL one at TNA, and in Oxford. So yeah, that sort of links those things together. I think they are in the history of the King's works. It's been a while since I looked at it. Amilia and India, you might be able to speak to this better because your memories are fresher than mine. But I think they are briefly mentioned, but there's so much more to be done on them. And I think, you know, the research that India and Amilia are doing as part of this is really showing that. Oh yes, the outcomes of your project. So I don't know if the two of you want to speak to that a little bit more, and then I can talk about how it fits within the wider ecosystem of the work that we're doing between Oxford and HRP.
So we've been tasked with creating a calendar of each volume, which is not exactly a transcription, but a summary using modern day language. So some of the obscure Tudor terminology or a defunct building terminology can be understood by a broader audience. And alongside that, we've created some supplementary material. So our spreadsheets looking at key information and terminology.
Yeah, great. Thanks, India. And yeah, just to say a bit more context. So as India mentioned, this will feed into a calendar which will be for internal use by HRP staff initially. But this project came about as a result of a collaboration between Oxford and HRP. Oh, I've got someone's on mute. Kristen Crowball, would you mind muting yourself? I don't know if I can mute. Oh, perfect. Yes. Yeah, so this project came about as part of a collaboration between the university and HRP, and there's a clear research need that these documents need to be looked at from HRP's perspective, and a clear link to sort of early modern history and yeah, the relationship between archives and buildings as well. So we initially had 2 micro interns looking at a couple of the Rawlinson manuscripts in the Bodleian, and then we opened it out to this placement opportunity, and we hope that this will snowball and build momentum from there, and that this will become a bigger collaborative project on the sort of movement of goods, materials and networks as represented in these very rich volumes. Great. Just looking through the question. Oh, so another one for India and Amilia. What kind of notable people exist on these lists outside the royal family? Are these just people who are part of the King's Privy Chamber, or do these include administrative individuals as well? And Adam Chapman has added, yes, what's the criteria for notability that is used here?
I wonder if I could just share the little bit that I included from my spreadsheet, because it would probably
absolutely.
Give a so this is this one. So this, I hope that it's not too small, but this gives a little taster of my list. I have nearly 100 names on my spreadsheet, and so this shows I've got the King's Fall. So I've been listing a mixture of royal family members, as well as anyone who is mentioned in the works accounts that aren't the workers, because it would be great to list all the names of the workers, like the carpenters and everyone, but as there are so many, I think it would take a very long time to do that properly. So I've been noting everyone who isn't one of the waged workers. So I have people like the deer keeper, because they were making a lodge for the deer keeper to live in the park and things like that. Visitors like the French ambassador, clerk of the green cloth, clerk of the kitchen. So anyone really who pops up who has works done in relation to them. And I'll stop sharing now.
Hey, thanks, Amelia. That's a really, really helpful graphic to have in front of us. And as you say, yeah, it's not, and as India said earlier, it's not a transcription, so it's a calendar. And India and Amelia only have 3 months on this particular placement, so it's not a deep dive on everything, but it's kind of representation of the kind of general trends that we can see in these documents. But that said, as I've mentioned before, both of you have already found so much and have been, yeah, very diligent during this placement, so it's great to see your rich findings. Got a couple of questions for Kath. There's lots of yay for Hull I can see in the chat, so lots of praise for the work that you've done with Hull as well. Daniel Reeds asked, as an East Yorkshire native, I found this project fascinating. Do your findings support the notion of Ravensnood being a recognisable town or port, or was it merely a landing place? You mentioned Burgesses. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's one of the exciting things about this island, I think, is that it has a very kind of precipitous rise and then a kind of dramatic fall. So the story kind of writes itself in some ways. It actually sends 2 MPs to Parliament on 2 occasions. It actually ends up being quite a big town. So at the time of its when it sort of begins to be destroyed by the sea, so it's on a big sandbank, which is why it kind of comes out of the sea and then disappears again. It has about 1,000 houses, so it's actually quite a big place. And one of the things that the manorial accounts help us do is to kind of see how much money is coming in and what their kind of outgoings are. And so that gives us a real sense of how big it is. And it's also meant things like, for example, we can work out, which we used with the school groups to quite a fine-grained extent, like what is on the island. So we got people to kind of build little models of it. So we know that there were 2 windmills at one point, for example. We know there was a tannery. We know there was a courthouse. There was a stone church. And so the participants in the workshops were able to kind of build little versions of it, some to take home and some to display in the exhibition. So again, that was a kind of nice element of the project. And these, I think, hearing about Amelia and India's work and also kind of Aimee's work in the archive to bring out some of those accounts is really interesting to me, because that's one of the things that would kind of surprise me about this project, that the ways in which those accounts can be so rich. And my colleague Sean Cunningham here also works on, has been doing some work on John Blank, the Black Trumpeter at the Tudor Court. And one of the richest sources for his life, apart from there's a painting of him in the College of Arms, but one of the richest sources for his life outside of the painting is the accounts, because the king gives him cloth for his wedding, and the king kind of gives him his livery. He plays at Richard III's coronation, so he's in Richard III's coronation accounts. So we get all of these moments which otherwise we wouldn't know about people's lives from these archival accounts. And so, sorry, I've gone off on a tangent talking about archival accounts, but cannot be stopped.
Kath, while you're on that, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on the question. I can see you've answered it in the chat, but about Old Norse and place name material, whether you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I can just speak to it very briefly. But so Ravensnood, obviously it's quite a strange name. It has those 2 names. So Ravensnood was already a settlement on the bank of the Humber, the north bank of the Humber, and Ravensnood does come from Old Norse, and that name, and that was there in the period when the Norse, there was a Norse presence in the area. The odd is kind of odd. It's I think one of the reasons that people are so interested in this is because of its funny name, but also we're not really sure where that comes from, because it's so long after the Norse presence that this island kind of rises from the sea. It rises from the sea in about our first record of it named anything is in 1251, but they talk about it as rising from the sea a certain amount earlier. So we think about 1230 is when it kind of
We seem to have lost Kath. Hopefully she will...
starts to become a real place. It would be quite surprising if they were using that. Oh no. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
You're back. Yes,
Kind of,
you paused and then it caught up very
Okay.
quickly. Hopefully everyone got that.
That's fine. It's not crucial, but basically there's a lot of argument about why it's called that. Our first version of it is ravens are opt. And so we're wondering if that might just be kind of, we've got ravens are inland and ravens are out at sea. So that is a kind of a question about it. But this is something that's ongoing archival research needed, I would say.
Great, and that's the point of this session, I guess, to generate more interest as well. And yeah, it's interesting about place names, isn't it? Because they're often a familiar hook for people. If they say these places or these names every day, they can be quite an interesting point of community engagement, of being something familiar or unfamiliar, and a way of unpacking and leading to bigger histories as well. We've got a question from Eve Pennington in the chat who says, thank you for everyone's excellent presentations. Based on your experiences of the heritage industry, do you have any advice for people who would like to work in this sector? Who wants to kick off there? Amy, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I would say advice. I would say one of the things that really helped me was volunteering. And I say that in twofold. I mean, heritage has always been a passion of mine, so I never kind of saw it as, oh, I need to volunteer to kind of get my foot in the door, but it was just something that I enjoyed doing. But from there, people within, I think, the heritage sector, I don't know if anyone would agree with me, it's quite small, and people know people. So just kind of volunteering, talking to people was one of the ways that I found was really helpful. And now even on LinkedIn every day, I'm finding new connections of people who work within the sector. But yeah, I would say volunteering is probably the way that helped me the most.
Thanks, Amy. Do others have thoughts? India and Amelia, I realise you're in the thick of your PhD journeys, but and obviously haven't quite finished your placement yet, but whether you have any thoughts about how it will feed into your career aspirations, or yeah, the sort of the skills and interests you might have in future.
Well, my PhD is an architectural history PhD, so this is quite a fitting placement for me, and you know, I have aspirations to work in the curatorial role in the future at some point. So I'm hoping this will slot in nicely. And it's been interesting working on a different time period. My focus for my PhD is late 17th century, so going back in time has been really useful from an archival perspective to help me access more historic archives more readily, and also in terms of just technical kind of building terminology, that's actually been quite useful.
Thanks, India. And Amelia, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I came to my PhD doesn't actually focus on physical spaces, really. It's more a textual based project, looking at manuscript pamphlets and printed things like that and poems. But this has really opened my perspectives a lot, because I've realized, yeah, how research does it is crucial to anything to do with heritage and archives and everything. So it's given me like a working knowledge of how these things happen and how the industry works, and so I'm really grateful for that.
Thanks, Amelia. It's great to hear. As my conflict of interest as co-supervisor, it's really great to hear how fruitful it's been. Kath, I don't know if you had any thoughts as well on kind of entering the sector.
Yeah, so I guess both with my kind of personal hand, so I can tell you very briefly kind of how I got into where I am, and I think that there are kind of often two ways into museums and heritage, and one way is the route that I went down, which was that I did an academic PhD about medieval studies. I'm a medievalist, and I kind of came into working at the National Archives through that lens. So I kind of came into my job at the National Archives through my academic kind of interests. there is, I'm going to just put it in the chat, and I guess this is more with my National Archives kind of hat on, a fairly new apprenticeship scheme which the National Archives has developed with the whole archive sector, where different archives will take on archive apprenticeships and you become a qualified archivist while you work in the sector. And this is actually really, I think, a really important and kind of exciting new step where the archive sector as a whole, so archive sector leadership, which is a department within the National Archives, has been working with archives across the country to kind of think about how to diversify the next cohort of archivists. And one of the things that people realized was that a kind of traditional university route, which is often a master's route, people often did a master's in archiving, was quite exclusionary to lots of people. And so this route is a route that can be gone into from school, and it also, people can go into it after university, but if they did perhaps a field that is not as relevant, and you work alongside being trained. So there's some details about the kind of apprenticeship scheme as a whole there, and that might be something that people are kind of interested in. And there are also, I think, increasingly a lot of the Archives and Records Association do a lot of really exciting work. They have a new professionals kind of section. Often those events are kind of free to attend and that kind of thing. So I think that there are, there's a kind of academic route into things, but I think increasingly there are routes that are not primarily academic, and that's really exciting. And I think hopefully we'll see more and more of that.
Thanks.
Can I just jump in and just say I definitely second all that. As doing an apprenticeship myself, it was phenomenal being able to kind of get that hands-on experience, but also be able to learn it in the classroom. It was quite literally sometimes from day to day. I'd learn something in the classroom and then I'd be facing a similar topic or theme within working. So I would, second all of what Kathryn said.
Amazing, thanks, Aimee. And just to go back to your point, I guess, about volunteering as well, volunteering can obviously take many different forms. So it might not feel like, financially viable, or you might not feel like you have the time for it, but there are lots of different ways to volunteer. So it might be that you do a kind of a small internship. We run micro internships through the Oxford University Careers Service. It might be that you do a sort of longer placement that's an embedded part. If you're doing a collaborative doctoral award, for example, it might be that you give sort of 1 day or an hour of your time. And even kind of further along career journeys, we still are volunteers in different ways. So, for example, I sit on the advisory board for the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, and so does Kath. So we volunteer our time there. So there are lots of different models of volunteering. If you instantly think, oh, that's not something that I can do, there are different ways in which you can kind of offer your time and expertise and gain experience. And making the most of those opportunities to kind of network and ask questions and acquire the skills that you want out of it too is really important. On that note, we've had a couple of people, so the point you made, Kath, about the programme that you flagged is great, because we've had a couple of people in the chat ask about opportunities. So Jane Sean has said, I work in a small museum archive and we have a number of potential student projects and possible placements relating to our collections and how they relate to other collections. How do I go about highlighting these to see if they're viable? Jane, you'd be very welcome to get in touch with me if you want to talk about micro internships through the Oxford University Careers Service. But there are lots of other opportunities, and I don't know whether Ruth, you want to say something as well about the opportunities through the centre.
Yeah, I was just going to put a note in the chat actually to say that the IHR runs paid internships each year. I'm going to put the link in the chat. So when they're advertised, you can find information about them. Some of those are kind of, you might think they're more academic in their sort of research positioning, but a lot of them are actually really quite practical in what they're doing. So last year I had an intern who was helping me to digitize some of the VCH content to put it onto British History Online. online. So she was learning lots of skills which are really transferable between an academic context and a heritage sector context. And then we, as the larger VCH community, that is a national a group of historians who are studying, researching and writing about place, and that is largely dependent upon the work of volunteers, and there are national trusts, there are trusts across the nation, as it were, so they're county trusts who are responsible for doing that. So if there is a county trust functioning in your area, then they would really welcome people who are interested in doing that kind of work.
And just to say, through Oxford, we have the Oxford University Heritage Network newsletter, which goes out twice per term, which anyone is welcome to sign up to. So if you just Google Oxford University Heritage Network and hit subscribe, we advertise opportunities that are Oxford based, but also further afield as well. So it's a sort of collation of different sector events that are going on and opportunities. So yeah, everyone's welcome to sign up to that on the call as well, if that might be useful. And things like Leicester Museum Jobs Desk as well. I think they advertise internship opportunities too, and smaller placements. So keeping an eye on those. Just going through the chats. Gosh, it's very lively. It's a sign of a very engaged audience. Yeah, Jessica Beck has asked if there are placements that don't require your PhD to be third-party funded. I think most of the ones, like the type that India and Amelia have undertaken, are advertised through the sort of collaborative DTP programs, but that's not to say that there aren't some. So I think sort of joining mailing lists and sort of looking at sector websites like Leicester Museum Jobs Desk will help there again. Emily Cole has asked, I wonder if India and Amelia could say anything about the challenges of 16th century handwriting, how you found it, how you learned and improved your skills, and whether you found any helpful resources. Emily said, I'm thinking of doing some training for a colleague in paleography, hence the question. Thank you.
When Amelia and I got recruited to this placement, we had to do a paleography task to check that we were up to scratch, and this one-page PDF arrived in my inbox, and I looked at it and I just shook my head. I thought, I can't understand this. And so I did a quick scrabble around, and I found on the National Archives website a great resource looking at just examples of lots of different examples of paleography from this period. There's an online course somewhere within the University of Cambridge's website with similar examples. And so kind of going over and over, like deciphering certain letters. Anyone who knows paleography of this period will know, don't look how they look these days. But once you crack the code, then you're in. And the more time you spend looking at these documents, you get your eye in, so to speak. But yeah, so basically, I think for anyone starting out looking at the sort of paleography, just examples of how certain letters are formed was just super helpful. And then just spending time. It was a shame because I think the National Archives online course has been archived, but there's still information available online. But a more national resource might be useful for other people accessing this sort of archive.
I'm going to jump in there and just say, watch this space, in progress.
I know I found the Borthwick Institute at York have got paper guides that I think you can order them online. I had one many years ago when I was an MPhil student that I found very helpful for letter forms as well. So yes, watch this space for what Kath and her colleagues are cooking up, but there are also kind of readily available guides online. Yeah, thanks for sharing that in the chat as well, Kath. Tony's asked whether Amelia can share some of the insights that you've gained in tracking down archives relevant to your studies. So I've seen you've answered that. Everyone's answering, everyone's being very diligent in the chat and writing responses. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that more, Amelia.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I just popped that link in there because that's Early Stuart libels has been so useful for me because my work is on scandal and corruption between 1614 and 1621. So Early Stuart libels is right in my period, and it lists it's an index of all the, well, yeah, probably all the poems that were written in manuscript version form, and which was circulated around among networks of people, and it lists every location of where each version is. So that's really useful. And then I've just popped a few other pointers in the chat too. Yeah, English short title catalogue was so useful, which was run by the British Library, but it's still down. But there are also physical copies of that. And that says where everything is.
Great, thanks, Amelia. Are there other questions? I'm still working through the chat and just seeing if there are others that I haven't spotted. But do any of the speakers have questions of each other, actually? Because it's an opportunity. All of you are never in the same room together, so I wondered if you had questions you wanted to ask of each other.
I have a question for Amy. Sorry, Kath, do you want to go? You had a question. No, okay. So I was really interested, Amy, in your conversation about the decision-making process and this relationship between archives and the kind of the heritage and the kind of World Heritage status of Blenheim, and then this kind of commercial element of it, and the way that the space was used and the need for the space to be able to make money, because that's kind of how the conservation money is raised. And I just wondered, like a lot of the discussions that we've been having today have kind of been about sort of research and the heritage sector as this sort of detached, floating kind of idea, whereas you're really working at the heart of the heritage space that you're working in also has to be commercially viable and it has to make money. And could you just say a little bit more about how kind of the archival research was playing into this kind of the decision making was, what's in the archives, but what actually do we need this space to be functionally usable as and to make money, and how those things work together?
Yeah, it is a really interesting question and problem. I don't know if problem's the right word, but something that we do face day to day, because Blenheim it's a home. So the Duke still lives here, whether he's actually in the building or not is here and there, but it is their home. Like you said, it's a visitor attraction. We have over 1 million visitors a year. It's a World Heritage site, so that comes with legislations and processes and policies that we have to follow. So it's really a juggling act, and it's with all the different team members that we have here that kind of makes a well-oiled machine, I believe. But then about the using of the spaces and what's used because it needs to be used and what's used because we want to make money is definitely a topic that is coming up more and more as we find that we kind of need to move with the times. And ultimately, I would say it depends who you talk to at Blenheim, the answer that you will get. And one of the things that I've learned in my role definitely is kind of to put on what we call the commercial hat and take it off when we're making these kind of decisions, or when I'm in meetings and these decisions are being made. I would say, being biased, the heritage and the asset that we have here is what is most important. However, you have to acknowledge that this will only remain if we do make money. So it is consistently a question that's always been asked, and we have a whole body of people that support us in this. So that could be, for example, Nick Cock Architects, or the architects who've worked on Blenheim for a long time and so know the history of the building. So they will come from that kind of heritage architecture background. And we work with Historic England, We work with obviously West Oxfordshire District Council. So all these different players kind of feed into these decisions, and ultimately we try and make sure that it's balanced across the board, that the heritage isn't at risk, but also money can be made. And sometimes it does go wrong and heritage is put at risk, and sometimes it does go wrong and money isn't made. But each time it's about learning from those mistakes. Where did we go wrong? Were we leaning too closely to one side or the other? But with every decision made, it is something that has to be considered, whether this is commercially viable, or is this going to impact the World Heritage status, which is something that we take really seriously. Just the other day, my manager was in the Conservation Committee, which is the trustees and the family, all our senior management, and she has to justify every I would say every pound that she spends in terms to this board, who will interrogate her. Why was this spent here? Why was it not done this? Why are you doing this? So it's always in the back of our mind in everything that we do. And I would say there is no answer. And also it just depends on who you ask, but it's something that we consider really carefully.
Thanks, Aimee. Really great illustration of all the competing factors at play in heritage decision making. Kath, did you have a question for some of our other speakers?
Yeah, but I think there's one in the chat about public engagement with archives. So maybe we can, it keeps moving, so I keep losing it. So I want to make sure everyone has a chance to.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for keeping an eye on it. It's jumping around me as well, and I'm appreciating your work.
Yeah, I was wondering about, I was wondering if the speakers could talk briefly about their experience of public engagement with archives and whether they think there are any growth areas. So maybe I could talk about that very briefly and then I can pass on to you guys. But one of the things that has been really exciting for me about my job here is the real breadth of our audiences. So we have a very big family history audience, and historically that has been the majority of the researchers at the National Archives, because we hold the census, we hold a lot of military records. People are obviously very interested in their kind of ancestors' military pasts. We also hold a lot of kind of criminal records, transportation records. So we have a lot of resources that are really useful for people from America or Australia or New Zealand or Canada who are doing their family history as well. So we have this very, very large family history audience, which is something that I had not really engaged with before as an academic researcher. But now the kind of majority of people who will ask me questions when I sit on the research desk, so we kind of have shifts on the research desk, will be questions about family history. So that has been a really exciting new audience for me, but those people have been engaging with work and I think have not traditionally been seen as researchers. And I think that is kind of, in some ways, that's a more important audience for academics to think about as researchers. You know, some of these people know these records better than I will ever know them, because they've spent so long thinking really carefully about where their family fits into these particular moments in history. So in some ways, I guess I'm turning that question around a little bit, which is, we have this huge constituency of people who've been engaging with archives, who are kind of local historians and family historians, who I think have been kind of looked down on a little bit by academic historians, but actually their research is so meticulous and it's so careful, and they come to the archives because they've exhausted all the things they can do online and they want to look at a real document. And that's so exciting to have that kind of ability. And actually those people are taking, I think we could learn a lot from them about public engagement too, because they're taking our documents out of the archive and they're taking them to their local communities, and they're saying, look, that building on the high street used to be this, and like, let's put a plaque up, or let's, you know, put a picture up about this. And I think that some of my colleagues are doing some really amazing work relating to this. So my colleague Chloe Lee has been working with the Tilbury port to kind of think about the arrival of lots and lots of ships from the Caribbean, and so to kind of think about how they might do that in situ, that kind of remembering that. So we have the documents, we've got these passenger lists of people arriving. So obviously the Windrush passenger list is probably the most famous one, but we have all these physical passenger lists. But in the site where those people arrived, there's not really a record of that. And so I think that one of the things that we're thinking about quite a lot, obviously with my Ravensor project, with a lot of my colleagues' other projects, is kind of bringing this like national archive kind of back to the places that it's about. And not only that people need to come here, because I'd love more people to come here. I think being able to see these original documents is so valuable, but also thinking about the ways that our documents, so another colleague of mine is working on the Gresham Colliery disaster. So this disaster in North Wales where a lot of people died. But we have a lot of material about that which the community had never even seen, and so she was able to take some of that facsimiles up, and we're currently working on seeing whether we could do a day display of some of those documents in the local area. So kind of thinking about those kind of elements, I think, has been really valuable. So I think we just have, there's kind of a lot of opportunities that the archives have not always been great at recognizing, perhaps, and the academic historians, and I include myself in that, right? That was my kind of work for a long time, have not always been great at recognizing either. So I think that's something that's really kind of exciting, but it's also very daunting because the National Archives has something from every place in the country, right? And so there's also elements of resource, right? So like any town in the UK, like any person could come and we would have something relevant for them, which is great. But it's also a bit overwhelming, right? And so there's also kind of questions about resource, and that was really interesting to hear Aimee kind of reflect on that too. So yeah, thanks all of you.
Thanks, Kath. You certainly got your work cut out. I guess linking back to that question on resource, and there was a comment in the chat about inequality of resource as well. The sector is very mindful of this at the moment. So there are far more and growing opportunities for sort of community practitioners to take up paid internships and other opportunities, some of which I know are advertised through the IHR as well. So yeah, just speaking to that, if we can mobilise en masse, hopefully we'll get through all of this work that needs to be done. I don't know if anyone else from the group, from our speakers, had any thoughts on that question in particular about public engagement with archives. No worries if not.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think Blenheim is interesting because there are private, and like I said, there are plans and visions to make it into the public, but probably facing some of the same issues that Kathryn mentioned. As I kind of briefly mentioned in my presentation, at the moment our archives are looked after by one lady with a few part-time staff. So again, it's kind of that resourcing of, we would absolutely love to share what we have with people, but having enough people to make sure that it's done correctly, I think, is a really big issue. So, and we've talked about kind of getting into the sector. So yeah, I'm really passionate about kind of promoting heritage, the heritage sector, so that we can get more people, so we can do the things that we want to do and kind of invite more people in, so that we have the resources there to kind of share our stories.
Thanks, Aimee. And yeah, just to flag, we've had a couple of our Oxford micro interns working alongside the Blenheim team on sifting through these archival materials and supporting that. I was just reminded because Damilola Odamayo has joined the conversation. She's amongst the participants here, and she's our brilliant careers advisor for heritage. So those of you who are at Oxford, please do use the career service resources. They're brilliant. And if you're affiliated to other universities or institutions, please do seek out support from your career service as well, because I'm sure they'll be able to signpost you to lots of brilliant opportunities and networks in this area as well. I'm mindful that it's 9 minutes to 1 and everyone's stomachs are probably rumbling, and we've worked our speakers very hard. I don't know, Ruth, whether you wanted to share. We had a slide deck, didn't we, whether that's available for us to just share at the end with some upcoming opportunities that people can get involved in.
So hopefully you can all see these. So this is just an overview of Victoria County history, which we mentioned earlier. And then Rachel, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, so this is another placement that's been set up by our colleagues at Historic Royal Palaces. It's currently only open to Open Oxford Cambridge DTP students because it's through that AHRC tranche of funding. And it's a similar project, so it's looking at archives in relation to curatorial practice. So the details are there, they're on the Open Oxford Cambridge DTP website. The deadline's Friday the 3rd of January, and it's a flexible placement that can either be undertaken 6 months part-time and 3 months full-time. So if you are funded via that route, please, and you've been inspired by what you've heard today, particularly from India and Amilia, please do have a look at that.
Great. Again, some more information about Layers of London for those of you who are interested in that, one of the centre projects, a really interesting way in which you can kind of engage in producing information about places. And then here are just some of our forthcoming or upcoming CHPPC events. The next one is on Wednesday, the 4th of December. Most of our events are held in the evening and online or hybrid, so in London and online. So the next one is about community and public history in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And then Rachel, this is some information that you shared.
Yes, so a couple of collaborative doctoral award opportunities. So if you are looking to do a PhD and you're not sure what to do, or you have an interest in these areas, please do consider applying for them. So the first one's on the interwar architects, the partners Seeley and Paget, and their contribution to 20th century architecture. That's between the University of Oxford and English Heritage. And then the second one is on Chaucer's Thameside life and poetry for the medievalists among you, which is a collaboration between the University of Oxford and Kath's colleagues at TNA as well. And yes, anyone with the right sort of qualifications and who fits the requirements can apply for those. So to find out more about those, just follow the link that's there on the slide. And then there are a couple of general events coming up. So there's the Commonwealth Heritage Forum are running free online lectures during November and December. So the first one will be by Alex Kent, which is addressing heritage at risk through coastal connections, looking at case studies from the Commonwealth and beyond. So the link's there if you would like to join those online. And there's also a course that's happening through the University of Oxford's Department of Continuing Education that anyone can sign up for, which is on material legacies of empire, and that's a 3-day course. There is a fee involved in that, but you can see the details via the link again there on the screen.
And we can share these links. I'm going to send out an email to everybody who signed up for today's session once the recording of it is available online. So we'll also add some of these links to this. Just various information about more events that the centre will be running. This one is in 2025. Again, this is in February 2025. And then just a few more. I think this is the last one. This is about place-based histories beyond the academy. And yeah, we've got someone talking here from the Victoria County History and English Heritage.